Hello and good evening to those of you just joining us. We'll get started in just a few moments, okay? All right. Hello, if you're just now joining us, we'll be with you in just a few moments. All right, just for sake of time, I think we'll go ahead and get started here tonight. My name is Jason De La Rosa, and I'm the Director of Career and Professional Development here at St. Edward's University. And so thank you for joining us tonight for this month's installment of Topper Career Talks, which is brought to you by the St. Edward's University Alumni Association and Career and Professional Development. So just a few housekeeping items before we get going for the evening. Please make sure that you leave yourself on mute. We will go ahead and unmute you if we call on you for a question. To submit any questions though, please use the Zoom chat feature. So the event team will go ahead and monitor the chat and will present submitted questions to the panelists. There will be time to ask questions at the end of the presentation, but if things pop up as we go through, feel free to send those in the chat box and we will keep an eye on those. To have the best view of the panelists, we would suggest considering changing your Zoom view from gallery to speaker view. And that feature is located at the top right of your screen. It will either say gallery or speaker view, and you will want to change it to speaker view. So tonight's topic is acing the interview. If you've joined us for some of our previous presentations, we have been building on developing a resume, developing a LinkedIn profile. And so at this point in time, hopefully we are getting you ready to ace that interview. So Julie Zenfine, who is one of our career coaches, will be leading us out on our tutorial tonight. And we have two wonderful panelists joining us this evening. So Christine Zenteno, who is one of our alumni, is the Human Resources Specialist at the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. We also have Dr. Melissa Esqueda, who is our Associate Vice President of Human Resources, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at St. Edward's University. So without further ado, I am going to pass it off to Julie for our interview tutorial.
Thanks, Jason. So as Jason just mentioned, before we were kind of talking all about the ramp up to the interview and on the application process. So tonight we're focusing more on how to ace that interview. And part of that starts with what you do beforehand. So as you can see on this slide, doing your research. So one question that you can always almost guarantee you're going to be asked is, why are you interested in this company? And why are you interested in this position? And when you're being faced with those types of questions, it's really, really important that you don't say very basic things that everyone knows, or that you found out from 2 seconds of Googling, or that really are not focused on the company or the position, but more just like some fringe benefits or something like that. So when you're doing your research, I really recommend thinking about some of the following points. Jason, if you can click. So think about, what is it about the company's culture, maybe their mission, their vision, something that you saw in the news that they're doing, the impact maybe that they're having on the community. Again, go beyond just kind of like what they do and what is very common knowledge. So particularly if you're applying to a giant tech company like Apple or Google, it's not good enough just to say you want to work there because they're Apple or because they're Google, because that's pretty much what everyone applying there wants to do. You also want to, again, make sure you're focusing like on that company and not things that you want from them. So it sounds really like, who would do that? But I talked to someone once who interviewed a candidate that said they wanted to work at the company because they wanted to be able to wear flip-flops and participate in Free Beer Fridays, which would be fun, sure. But again, that shouldn't be your main reason for why you're interested in the company. And if it is, try to find something else that you say in the interview process. Those points that I mentioned in the second bullet point of thinking about culture, mission, vision, impact, that's also important points to keep in mind when somebody says, what do you know about us? So, similarly to what I just said, you don't just want to say, well, you're a giant in the tech industry and you're located in Round Rock. Again, those are kind of like very basic things. So you want to think about what you know in terms of, again, maybe the difference that they're making. Do they have expansion plans coming in the future? Are they opening a new office? What are things that are like, again, making an impact in their business or again, on the community, something like that. So you've got to be more specific than some of those very generalized points. Also, when you're thinking about the position, definitely don't emphasize yourself. So not, I'm interested in this position because I want to work for a startup, but think about, okay, what it is that you have to contribute in that startup. So if you have a background in HR and recruitment, and the company, that startup's really looking to bring more people to their team, talk about how you can leverage your experience there. Another question that you're often going to get is something like that last one: walk us through your resume, or tell me about your experience. So it's an important part of your research, which again sounds like you should know yourself, but we're often not used to thinking about our experience in terms of how we communicate it outwardly. Maybe we applied to the job like 6 weeks ago and we don't even really remember what we talked about in the cover letter or what we presented in our resume. So if you're not familiar with what you submitted, you might, contradict yourself in something that you're talking about in the interview because you forgot, oh, I said this is why I was interested. And now that I'm in the interview, I'm saying something different. So make sure that part of that research process is getting to know yourself. And the next point would be also to leverage your network as you're doing your research. So if you know somebody that works at the company or somebody was an internal referral to you, get advice from them about, what you might expect in the interview. If there's common questions they know people tend to ask. If somebody referred you, or even if they didn't refer you, but you know that they work there, it's a good thing to mention, throughout any of these questions. So if you say, hey, Jason's always talking about working in a career office and how fun it is and what a great team they are, and that really inspired me to want to work here, that is a good indication of, again, you've kind of done your research, you know a little bit more on a personal level what you're talking about. And it's a reminder of like, oh yeah, Jason referred them. Maybe I should go talk to Jason kind of about what else they can tell me about this candidate. So really, really make sure that you don't skip the research part of prepping for an interview. Again, even if it's just your self-research, these are all really important steps. So you're not just trying to wing it when you get into the interview. So that being said, if you want to go into the next slide, which is emphasizing practice, practice, practice. I cannot stress that enough. I think it's very rare that people are able to go into an interview without having prepped questions, again, without having done their research, particularly if you haven't been in the job search in a while, or maybe, you've gotten lucky in your last few positions that you just progressed within your company and you didn't really have to have a formal interview for them or something like that. So make sure that you're practicing and you're being prepared for giving practical examples and being able to answer open-ended questions. Just if you want to do the next bullet. So often you'll get questions like, tell me about your experience with this, or tell me about a time that you, used Tableau or had to give presentations to large groups. And you want to be able to incorporate strong examples and give enough detail so that you're not just kind of giving flat answers. So you don't just want to say, oh yes, I use Tableau every day, it's cool. Okay, well, tell me a little bit more. What do you know how to use in Tableau? How do you think this is going to impact the work that I would need you to do in this position? That kind of thing. Part of the practicing too is like reviewing common questions that maybe have tripped you up in the past, or maybe you just never really knew how to answer. So one thing I always like to focus on is people often struggle with questions that have sort of a negative connotation. So something like, tell me about a time that you failed, or what is one of your weaknesses? And I think people get concerned because they feel like these questions are trapping them into something, and they're really not. We all have times where something didn't go according to our plans, or that's something that we need to work on that we're improving. But the key is that when you're answering those types of questions, that you're not just focusing on the negative, but you're reframing towards maybe what you learned or how you go about solving those problems or improving in the future, because that's what people want to see. The other key thing too is make sure your failure or your weakness is not like a key component of the job. So if you're applying for a sales position that's focused on a lot of cold calling, saying that you're not comfortable on the phone, probably not the best example of a weakness to give. Think of something that, again, could be applicable in a professional environment, but probably is not critical to your day-to-day work. The other thing with that too is people often want to reframe those things into like a strength or something they perceive to be a strength, like, oh, I'm just a perfectionist, and so therefore, like, it's really a strength. Don't do that. That's very cliche. It's very overused. Again, just be honest. People want to see your self-awareness. They want to see how you tackle problems and find solutions. Oh, you're good. You can go to the next one. So, So another effective method when you're answering interview questions, speaking back to, like I mentioned, giving practical examples, is something called the STAR method. So this stands for situation, task, action, result. So what I mean by that is making sure that you're providing enough detail so that the employer or the person interviewing you can fully understand what was going on. So like I said, going back to Tableau, don't just say, oh yeah, I use Tableau, but I talked about giving context to it. So example that I've kind of displayed here is, let's say somebody says, tell me about your experience with a distraught customer. Well, don't just say, the customer was really rude to me, I hated it, it was the worst day ever, the end. Give some details. So here you're seeing, okay, setting up the situation, explaining why the customer was upset, what was going on. The second would be going back to the T, the task. So what did you have to do in that situation, or what was your responsibility? So in this case, the task would have been, okay, this customer called in, they were upset about this. So what I needed to do was check the details, see what was going on, figure out what I needed to do, which then leads into the actions. So this is what was going on. This is how I assessed the situation. So what was the action that I took? Go to the next one. So explaining exactly what you did to address it. So if it was something like this customer service issue, you looked into it, now you're figuring out, okay, what can I remedy it? How can I remedy it? Am I responsible for it? Do I need to get my manager involved? Figuring out what I can do to solve it, which then again leads to the result. So what was the outcome of your work? So in this case, I'm just being, okay, the idea is you went above and beyond, you figured out a refund, you gave them a credit, and now they were happy, and they gave you a great customer service review, and everything was fine in the end. So obviously not all situations wrap up perfectly like that, but the point here is, again, that you didn't just say, I had an angry customer, I fixed it at the end, but you really showed someone how you worked it through, what were the factors working for or against you, and what happened afterwards. So you don't have to memorize like the STAR method verbatim, and you definitely don't want to walk through it like I just did. You would say it more fluidly all at once. You wouldn't go, this was my situation, this was my task. But again, as you're practicing examples, it's a good way just to think about, are you giving enough details? And the other thing about this too is that, totally lost my train of thought. I don't know. Okay, make sure you're giving enough details. And if you want to go to the next one. So looking the part is another really important piece of the interview, of course. So it sounds basic, but why I like to mention this is because I think more traditional kind of standards of what we view as professional dress have changed a lot lately. And particularly when you work in a city like Austin, or depending on the type of environment you work in, it's a lot harder to say, oh, you should definitely be wearing this, or you should be wearing that. So things that you have to kind of take into consideration when you're applying for a job is, what is the industry that you're going for? Some of those more traditional kind of standards of business formal, like you see the first person wearing on this slide, that's probably still appropriate if you work in financial services, you work for an accounting firm. His tie might even be a little bit too out there for some of those environments. You still might want to be more neutral. But that probably wouldn't be the case if you were working like at a tech company like Indeed. That's a much more casual, laid back environment. Something like what the person on the right is wearing is probably more of what people wear in that environment on a daily basis. Now, the caveat is obviously being that a recruiter once said to me, the way she describes it is, don't dress like you already have the job. So just because I might wear flannel every day and jeans because I work in that job, when you're in the interview, you don't already have it. So it's not a bad idea to still kick it up a notch, maybe try to find like a happy medium, like the person in the middle is wearing, or something like that. Don't forget too, again, kind of going back to what I said before about like preparing and researching, it's totally okay to ask a recruiter their opinion on what you should wear if you're not really sure. And again, particularly where the dress code is a little more lax or ambiguous. I had a recruiter tell me one time, if you show up wearing a jacket, you're going to look out of place. So that was like a really good, okay, cool. I know that I need to, wear slacks, be a little bit kind of formal, but not too crazy. Another thing that I always like to point out when we're talking about looking the part is being really mindful of kind of, again, this maybe falls more into traditional standards, but how you're presenting that, may not necessarily be in line with like a company's dress code. So visible tattoos, piercings, green hair, stuff like that, which again kind of sounds really old school. And I usually recommend erring on the side of caution with those sort of things. And it's totally not meant because I want to stifle anyone's like self-expression or identity, but it's just because, you never know how that's going to come across or how that fits in with company standards of dress code. And also too, it can be distracting too. So maybe like I have a really awesome sleeve, but I don't want the interviewer to be staring at my sleeve the whole time. I want them to be thinking like, okay, like I'm really interested in what she's saying about her experience, not, I have no idea what she said because I was just, counting the flowers on her sleeve. Like that's not, that's not where you want people to be focusing. And I always just recommend if a dress code, something like, again, a tattoo or a piercing or hair, if that's something that's going to be like a huge deal breaker for you in a job, you can kind of decide that when you've been offered the position. But I usually operate from the philosophy of like, don't deny yourself the opportunity to get to that point because somebody thought, you couldn't fit in within those standards if you needed to. So if later on you're like, hey, deal breaker, I don't want to have to dress like this every day, totally fine. But I personally, usually the advice I give is give yourself the opportunity and decide later on. So try to like, scale it back, err on the side of caution when you're in that initial part of the interview. Next slide. So another thing that you're going to always guarantee you're going to be asked is, do you have any questions for us? Please don't be like my 20-year-old self who's like, nope, no questions. I'm all good. Peace out. That was a huge embarrassment, but I learned from it. Basically, the big thing that comes across when you don't ask any questions is that you're not really interested and you don't really care. And you should have questions. You should have things that you want to know, which can be challenging because I think people are always wondering, what should I ask? What's an appropriate question? And I always put it back on them. I'm like, well, what do you really want to know? What is important to you about the company or the position that is going to influence whether or not you accepted the job offer? Is there something that you're looking at in the job description or something that somebody talked about in the interview that's maybe ambiguous to you and you need more information about that? Do you want to know more, again, about some of those intangibles like the team culture or things like that? The key is that you're just avoiding any questions that, again, detract from your genuine interest in the company or the position. So that would be things more like fringe benefits. So that's things like, again, oh, can I wear flip-flops? How soon can I take vacation? How soon can I get a raise? Also early on, that can be more basic things like salary or other benefits. And not that those aren't important factors to take into consideration when you're considering whether or not you want to accept a job offer, but those types of questions are more appropriate when you've been given the offer already, because you know that you're in demand, you know that they want you, and now you just kind of need to drill into some of those nitty-gritty details before you make your final decision. So again, if it's not at that final offer stage, avoid those types of questions. The other thing to keep in mind too is making sure that the questions you're asking are appropriate for the audience. So oftentimes, your first round interview might be with a recruiter or someone who doesn't sit on the team that you're going to be ultimately be interviewing for. So it's not appropriate to ask a recruiter something like, well, what is your management style? Because that recruiter is not going to be the person managing you. So think about what questions you have, but also think about like at what point in the process they're appropriate to ask and who could be the person to most effectively answer them. Next slide. After the interview. So it's also critical to remember that the after period is still kind of an interview period. Something I always recommend doing is sending a thank you email within 24 hours of the interview to, ideally everyone, unless, you interviewed with 100 people, that's probably not realistic, but, a group of, 1 to maybe 6 or something, it's more feasible to send one to everyone individually, or at least to say something like, if I sent it to Jason, hey, Jason, thank you, whatever else I'm going to say, please extend my gratitude to the rest of the search committee as well. What's important about this is, one, I think just pure and simple, you should be grateful that you got the interview. You know, we've talked about in previous presentations, you might be 4 out of 200 applicants that even got offered an interview. So you should thank people for that. That's a big deal that they considered you that far in the process. Also too, this is your opportunity to show your professional communication, your professional courtesy, to reiterate your interest in the position. It's certainly not going to, of course, make or break you in terms of if you know, or if you're really not qualified. It's not like, oh, they're not qualified, but they sent a thank you. No, that's not going to make a difference. But if I'm debating between 3 candidates who all have a very similar background and all perform very well in their interview, I'm going to scrutinize kind of every piece of it. And I might say, well, this person sent me thank you and this person didn't. So just things to think about. With that too, any correspondence you have afterwards can be scrutinized as well. So, you know, respond in a timely manner. Don't tell someone, oh, I didn't get back to you because I was on vacation. I've heard people say that before. I'm like, well, you're not on vacation from my yet. You should still be responding to me. And again, they're taking into consideration the timeliness of your correspondence now is also going to link to how you might act in the job. Next bullet. And then, you know, follow up appropriately if needed. So if someone gives you kind of an initial time, they said they'd reach back out and it's 2 days later and you don't hear from them, step back, give them a minute. If it's been excessively long after that, you can certainly check in, but don't be like checking in every day. Don't be bothering them all the time. It's kind of like what people say about dating. If they want to talk to you, they're going to call you. So just kind of relax a minute and give them some space. But you know, you can be courteous in checking in as well. Next slide. So virtual interviews, obviously important, especially given the current climate. So I just want to kind of emphasize a few points as these become used more and more. Making sure you're setting up well in advance. That includes figuring out where you're going to sit, how you're going to look at that angle, downloading any software that you need. I usually recommend downloading it on multiple devices in case one fails, testing it out if you've never used it before, kind of going through the practice. So when you're preparing your questions, practice using that software rather than just in your head, because it's a totally different experience. To kind of minimize any issues or, you know, technical problems, make sure you have all the important info with you. Zoom links or whatever other access points you need, people's phone numbers in case something goes wrong, whatever schedule if you're jumping into multiple appointments. Making sure you're minimizing distractions, but also acknowledging them. So ideally, we don't have, you know, a bunch of people running around or a dog barking, but sometimes that's unavoidable. So if those things are unavoidable, just get ahead of it. So somebody doesn't think, does she really think it's cool that, you know, that person walked back and forth 20 times? But if you say, hey, unfortunately, I'm in a studio and this is the only space we have right now, so you might see my partner walking back and forth. Again, it's not ideal, but at least you told them, okay, I know this is a thing. I'm sorry. This is what's going on. Something that's really hard, and I know I struggle with this, is maintaining the same focus and eye contact that you would in person. So don't just stare at the little picture of yourself. Try to make sure you're still looking at people appropriately. And the biggest thing is just keep calm, particularly if there's a technical glitch. Just let people know, just keep going. Virtual interviews are a lot harder to control than in-person ones. So just, you know, give yourself a break and know that issues, glitches, internet, whatever, it happens to everyone. So just try your best to maintain your composure and not let it derail you. Next slide. So one thing that I want to mention, going back to as you're prepping and preparing, we have a wonderful software to help you with this. It's called Big Interview. It's a virtual simulated interview. You can record and share your responses. You can select specific questions that you want to answer, or you can do like a roulette where they're randomized. And we now are really excited to offer this software for alumni. So if you, that is the link that you'll use, and then that'll bring you to a screen that looks like this. Oh, you're good. Yeah. And then from there, you'll hit register up in the upper right, which will bring you to the following screen. So you'll see that you'll just fill in your contact info and create a password, and then you'll need an organizational code that links you to the St. Edward's account, which is that one down at the bottom, the topper alum_CAPD. And then you have access to the straight virtual practice software, which again, I think is really helpful in any prep situation, but particularly as we're doing more virtually, like I just mentioned, it's a good chance to see yourself on camera and really see how that works. Next slide. There's some other helpful resources that we have. So we have some interview quick guides that our career coaches wrote that you can find on our website. And then I think I've referenced the Muse in some of these presentations before. I really like a lot of their articles related to interviewing, but as well as other career search topics. So I've included some of those links on this slide as well. And that's it.
All right. Thank you so much, Julie. We really appreciate that. Julie, if you could do me a favor and drop that URL for the big interview for the alumni in the chat box, that would be fantastic. So with that, alumni, y'all are the very first people on this call to hear about this. We will be putting this on our career website in the near future, but y'all kind of get a sneak peek at it. And so we encourage y'all to use that and connect with our career coaches. But without further ado, I'm going to turn off the screen share, and we're going to bring our panelists on so you can see their faces. And so I'd like to just kind of start off with a question for both of you, and we'll kick things off with Christine on this. In your role, when you're interviewing folks, is there a recommended length of time for an interview response?
For me, I don't have a recommended time. Give me enough detail to answer the question. So it really depends on the type of question I'm asking. If I'm asking if you're familiar with the system or if you're familiar with some type of regulation, get in, get out, give it to me, and move on. If I'm asking you a behavioral question that might have different pieces of it, like the STAR that Julie mentioned, what happened, how would you handle it, that might take a little bit longer. But as far as a specific amount of time, no.
All right. Melissa, how about you?
I think that it's important to focus on clearly answering the question completely, especially sometimes when we're nervous. Maybe we just hear a part of the question and don't hear the rest of the question. So we say our first answer, but then don't even bother answering the rest of the question. I would say take your time, and I love the STAR method. I personally am always looking for those pieces because I feel sometimes like if you speak generally about a subject or generally about an experience or a skill without being able to substantiate some of that or give an example, as Julie discussed in the STAR method, I get the feeling that maybe you don't really know as much about that item. And if you did, you would expand.
Awesome, thank you. So Melissa, I'm going to keep you on for this particular question, and Christine will kick it to you. But what advice in general would you provide for the audience regarding interview preparation and just how to get ready for those interviews?
I really like what Julie shared at the beginning of her presentation, and those are the very, very similar to the notes I had written for myself tonight. One of the first questions that I do always ask is, tell me why you're interested in this very particular opportunity. Because I think that a lot of times, especially people, if you're applying for several jobs and you're researching different organizations and that, I personally want to know that we're all very busy, but today when we decided to meet, you're very clear on what this position is, very clear what type of organization we are, and why you think that you may be a good fit for this role. So tell me why you're interested in this particular role and have a solid answer. That answer is not going to be the same for every single interview. It depends on where you're interviewing. And here I go again. I'm asking you, the research portion, researching the organization. I think that really gaining some understanding about the mission of the organization, the culture of the organization, and maybe where the organization seems like they may want to go in the future. Show that you have really put some time and effort into researching the organization and that you're truly interested in being part of the bigger picture instead of like, well, I'm just here because I need this job and I can't even really remember what job I applied for.
How about you, Christine?
I agree with Melissa and with Julie. Do a lot of research on the organization, find out, what their mission is, what are some of their key points, but also kind of remember what it was you were applying for. Reread through your resume or your application, because there may be follow-up questions that aren't specific to the job, but maybe something that you mentioned in your resume that they want to know more about. If it's a highly technical position, which is what I tend to advise on these days, I would also recommend researching anything mentioned in the job description that they might be responsible for. So if it's, a scientist that's responsible for doing particular types of maybe air pollution studies, you might want to, refresh your memory on what might be the standard practice now. Or if it mentions something about using a lot of different systems or equipment, familiarize yourself with that. And also it kind of gives you a leg up. Maybe you don't have experience with that, but if you have something related, maybe from your education, that you can kind of pull that in. But it's surprising the amount of times that we'll have someone that will ask them a question about something listed specifically in the job description and they can't answer that question. So really dig deep and kind of familiarize yourself with the job description and with how you're going to be able to fill that role. Any other things that might be interesting, anything that group is doing, whether it's the organization as a whole or a particular group in that organization that you're looking at, really familiarize yourself with those instances.
Thank you. So I think keeping along with you on this one, Christine, I think I know I've been on search committees or I've been in interview preps where sometimes a person will kind of do a little bit of jazz hands and they sound like they gave a wonderful answer, but when you dig in, there wasn't really much depth. I've been in others where they answered the question, it was thorough, but they weren't as eloquent or like they just weren't as, I think, confident in the responses. How do you respond to those different sets of interview styles?
So we approach them a little bit differently. I do as well. I'm looking for the way that you answer a question, but sometimes it may not be quite as eloquent. Maybe you're nervous. Maybe it's just one of those things of you might have some experience with it and you might be good at it, but you're maybe not quite confident in it. So I'm going to probably ask you a couple of follow-up questions. If I ask you a very pointed question, so for like an HR role that I'm looking for that deals with, FLSA, I might ask you a question about, well, how do we determine overtime and exempt positions? If you can just tell me, oh, and you give me a very nice definition of what overtime means and what exempt means, sounds great. But if someone can give me a little bit more information about it, maybe they didn't mention that particular one, but they kind of got around to it, I'll take that into consideration as well. So it's kind of more of an art to it. I'm looking at a lot of different things. I'm also looking at how you handle those questions that might have not been something you were expecting. So a little bit of nervousness might be okay in that case, but it really, again, depends on the question that I'm asking.
Melissa?
For me, it would depend on the type of role that the individual is interviewing for. For example, if they are going to be a trainer or presenter and you know that this is the essential job functions of this role, then some of those characteristics would probably be more important to me than not. But generally speaking, I also, as Christine said, realize that we're all a little bit anxious or nervous in that situation. And as long as the individual can just take their time and provide me with a detailed response, and again, possibly with a good example or something that really shows me that they understand what it is that I'm asking, I prefer that over how maybe confident they come across or how polished they come across. I mean, I think that some of that, especially when people are young, that's going to come with time. And I'm always looking carefully for the content the person is sharing versus how comfortable they appear.
Great, thank you. So another question before we move into audience questions, I just have to ask, do either of you or both of you have any interview horror stories or things that are just like a big no-no that you have seen time and time again? So I'll let either of you kick that off.
I'll start. I am serious when I say I've interviewed in several different settings people who do not know what they applied for. They don't clearly understand the role that they're applying for, and they must have, maybe one day sat down and used all afternoon and applied for several jobs, and just being able to answer the why are you interested in this position, and the person not even being very clear what that position is. That just shows lack of preparation, and also kind of a lack of respect for everybody's time. If you don't really even know why we're talking, that's kind of, that makes it difficult to get on from there. And then I guess it depends on the setting. It's okay to not be completely formal, as Julie mentioned, depending on the type of environment, but then also be super careful about not being very casual or just very jokey or friendly or whatever it might be, because maybe that comes across also as you don't take the situation seriously.
And I'll follow up on Melissa's. I too have sat in many interviews where people have not prepared and they might tell you, yes, I have experience with this. And then when you start asking questions, it's very clear they have no experience related to that. Or maybe they have very, very minimal, and it might not have been something that they needed to expand on in their resume. Be prepared. I've had people show up to interviews for professional setting in a spaghetti strap and flip-flops. Don't do that. Be mindful of the setting that you're applying for. Probably the worst interview I've ever had was I had an individual, every single question I asked, they answered with, this is close to my house and I need a job. You're probably not going to get a call back for that one. And in fact, I did not call them back for that job. But there are many things that, and we use them as stories and examples later, but just kind of making sure you're being prepared and really reading through the job that you're applying for before you get there. It would be helpful.
Great, thank you. So Melissa, I'll start with you on this one. And this comes from our audience. So good question here. How should somebody maintain eye contact and make good notes if they want to send thank you notes afterwards, right? Because I think if they're trying to make sure they've got everybody's names down, they're breaking that eye contact. Any suggestions or tips there?
I don't know, for me, as an interviewer, I would prefer for the person to be truly present in that moment. Like if I were sitting or just virtually, we're having a conversation, be truly present instead of looking away or trying to write or do all that too much. But if you feel the need to do that, I think just explain what you're doing. Like, okay, just want to make sure that I have your name correctly, write it down, instead of just appearing as if you're not truly present or truly paying attention. And I too would have problems with that. I still do. I wish I could walk in a room and remember all 5 names, and I'm not going to remember that, but I try not to take away from the time or attention I'm providing in the conversation.
Thank you. Christine, any tips on your end?
I would recommend that. Or if you're taking notes, you might want to mention that on the front end, kind of like what Julie mentioned before, if you're going to acknowledge some distractions. I'll often do that, not particularly with interviews, but in meetings, I'll be like, if I look down, I'm going to be taking some notes. But if you're in an interview setting, I would recommend waiting until the end and then ask them, do you mind if I just take a couple of notes? I'm going to make sure that I got this correct, and acknowledge it and let them know.
Great, thank you. As we're thinking about this world that we live in right now in terms of virtual settings and virtual interviews, should people use virtual backgrounds when they're in virtual interviews? Does it make a difference? If so, is there a specific type of background you would recommend? So we'll start off with Christine.
I don't particularly have a preference if you use a background or not. If you do decide to use a background, try to make it something neutral so that the person is not paying attention to your background instead of you. I've seen a couple of different ones. They're fun, but probably not as professional as what you would need for your interview. If you do decide to not go with a background, just make sure that anything behind you is not distracting. Or again, as Julie had mentioned, kind of try to acknowledge it, but try to also find a quiet place where you minimize that distraction.
Melissa?
I agree. I mean, I like when people feel comfortable about expressing themselves, and I don't have a real problem with the background as long as it's not something that's like terribly distracting, but it doesn't make that big of a difference to me. As long as it's not anything that's super odd or, but if it's something, just a, expression of yourself and it's something you like or whatever it might be, as long as it's something healthy, I think it's okay.
Thank you. So Julie mentioned earlier the idea of giving recruiters space and time. So how long after you'll hear from us by X date, is it appropriate to reach out if somebody does not hear back from them? And we'll start with Melissa.
Yes, and I do think it's a good idea at the end of the interview to ask, so what would the remainder of this process look like? The remainder of the hiring for this particular role? That way you have an idea, like, are they going to make a decision this week, next week? And in some cases, it may take a few weeks. So I always try to be real transparent about that. Like, this is a role that we need to fill right away. So I plan on making a decision by Friday or something like that. If not, I will say, it's going to take a lot of collaboration. I have to collaborate with other individuals. It may take me up to 3 weeks before I get back with anyone. So if you ask that question, you already have a better idea of the time frame. And then, yes, I think that if we met on a Monday and I said I'll get back with you on Friday and I haven't gotten back with everyone on Friday, I would be totally comfortable with people reaching out on Monday.
Christine?
I agree with Melissa. If they give you a timeline and you can ask up front, what does the process look like? How long are you, or when are you looking to fill this position? I would give them a little bit of time. So if they tell you, I'm going to have a decision by Friday, probably the following week, early in that week would be an appropriate time, but also maybe ask if there's someone that would be a best point of contact for that. Not every role, but in some organizations I've worked with, they prefer you not to reach back out to the supervisor, but instead to HR. So make sure that you're also kind of making that clear as well. Maybe just ask them and be like, is it okay if I contact you, after a certain amount of time, or is there a better contact for that?
Thank you. So I'm going to go back into another question from the audience. So if you find yourself applying for like a lot of jobs, you've really kind of been putting your name out there, but you're not getting the interviews, what sort of things should they be considering? What would you recommend to that particular applicant? And we'll start with Melissa.
I would wonder in that situation if your resume or cover letter reflect the essential requirements for the job. So on the job posting is different than a job description. The job posting will usually have a list of, you must have at least these skills or this, education or whatever it might be. So as long as you meet those requirements, make sure that that is reflected in your cover letter and in your resume. Secondly, sometimes it's easier to just use the same cover letter or resume and tweak it and try to send it out. But depending on the type of role and the type of job, it may be a better idea to really take some time to customize it as much as possible so that it connects, so that it is in alignment with that particular role that you are trying to interview for. Because if you're not making those little customizations, then you have someone that's reviewing all the applications or resumes and cover letters, and they too, naturally, we're all humans, are kind of looking for those key words or those key statements to tell us that you truly, one, do meet the requirements, and two, have the skills or knowledge that is needed for this particular role.
Christine?
I agree with Melissa. Really take a look at what you're putting together. For some cases, it does make sense, again, to use kind of more like a shell or a form document, but I would really focus on customizing it to the particular position. A couple of things that I often see. So in my current role, we require a state of Texas application that must be completed, and you cannot put a resume in lieu of that. And there are certain questions that if you don't answer them, it's considered incomplete. It goes nowhere. So make sure that however their preferred method of applying is Could you conform to that method? Also take a look at your keywords. Maybe you're hitting the keywords, but you're not really explaining it to someone very well, because often I'll come across resumes where they might mention that they used a particular system, but they haven't really told me what they were doing with it. Or they might mention, I was an accountant, but they didn't tell me what kind of skills that they used with it. Were they more with bookkeeping? Was it, financial risk analysis that they were looking at? Give a little bit more detail. And if you're still not getting these interviews, feel free to reach out to your recruiters or any of other support staff that they have listed. Maybe give them a call, ask them, hey, do you have any feedback? In my role, I answer questions all the time. I welcome questions, and I can always give you some, generic pointers for things that can help you along the way. But reach out to the career services. Whenever I was in between jobs, I reached out to them. They took a look at my resume, my cover letters, and gave feedback for that as well. But really try to tailor it to the specific job that you're looking at. That'll probably get better results for you.
I'd like to mention, Christine reminded me of something we experienced recently, and it was at St. Edward's. When you are applying for the type of role that requires for you to complete certain elements of the application, like Christine said, at her job, you have to complete the state application or whatever it might be. So if it says you must submit this application, along with that, provide us a cover letter, provide us a resume, do this and that. I mean, some applications are thorough. What we found when I went back to research what was happening in the system for this one role, why were we not getting the completed why were we not getting all these applications? Well, that's exactly what happened. People may have completed 3 of the 5 steps, but because they didn't complete one final document or sign off on one final document, it didn't complete the process. And so then it made it seem then that person would have never qualified for the interview, because they would have never been someone that actually came across as completing the entire application. So just be very careful, because the system, in the background, it may have nothing to do with whether or not the recruiter was looking at your resume or that. The system has to get to your application has to get to the recruiter. So there may be a hold back there on something maybe you didn't complete in the process.
So I'm going to take a moment to make a selfless plug for the Career and Professional Development team. So with that, right, I think that, like Christine mentioned, and I know having worked with Melissa very closely on a lot of things, use your career coaches. So keep in mind that the services of our office is available to you for life, right? If you left the Hilltop, you graduated from the Hilltop, you've got us. So Julie's one of our career coaches. We have 2 other career coaches on staff. We have me as far as pre-health students goes. And I'm going to share my screen really quick again. And mention that, you can certainly look for our Handshake database for any jobs that you might be looking for. We have a personal statement resume drop-off if you're applying for jobs and you need some resume help, or if you're applying for graduate professional school and you want some help on your personal statements. And how do you actually find the time to make the appointments? You will click here. So once you click there, as soon as it goes, you can certainly drop in and see us during drop-in hours. So we have a check-in form, and you can also request an appointment. If you have any problems with requesting appointments through Handshake, or you can't remember your login stuff, just contact us at seucareer.stedwards.edu, and we'll talk about that stuff more in just a moment. So it does look like we have another question from the audience. And so with that, it looks like Jordan had a question of, should I use keywords sparingly throughout my interview, or is there a better way to relay my skill set? So we'll kick things off with Christine.
Keywords for me are kind of hit and miss. I have some people that focus a little bit too much on the keywords and not enough on the substance, and that can really work against you. Because like I mentioned before, if they said, I'm an accountant, I do accounting, it doesn't really tell me very much about what you did as an accountant to see maybe what your particular skills are and how it relates to this position. So definitely use them, but also take the time to expand upon them to let the person know that you really understand what that means. Or make sure if your keywords might be, very, very broad, if there's a way to narrow it down. So instead of saying, like I have Microsoft Office skills, maybe pinpoint, I can work with Excel and do pivot tables. I can work with Visio is a newer one that we've started using. Kind of, yes, use them, but make sure that you have something else to also back it up.
I agree with Christine. It's okay to use the keywords, but I'm always looking for substance. I want to hear your example or an experience you had, or I want to know how you've worked with this, whatever it is we're talking about. So to say, let's say, I would say, well, what do you know about Title VII? And the person would just say, well, Title VII is da 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 da. I want to know how they've worked around the Title VII. You know, under what circumstances did they come to understand Title VII? Things like that. So keywords are okay, but just be able to provide more substance.
All right, Christine and Melissa, thank y'all so much for answering questions and being on the panel with us this evening. I'm going to wrap up the questions and then move on to the remainder of the slideshow. Let's give a virtual hand to Melissa and Christine. Thank y'all.
Thank you. Good luck.
All right, so with this, as we mentioned before, we would love to connect with all of you. So here's our URL. So it's career.stedwards.edu. And so we do offer a wide range of services for our alumni and undergraduate populations. Resumes, LinkedIn, cover letters, interview prep. You've got the access to Big Interview, but if you want to do the live thing, meet with a career coach. I think it's a great thing. We have a number of resources that are available to you as well. So those are all found on our website. So you can certainly contact us through the website, or you can email us, at sucareer@stedwards.edu. You can also call us, 512-448-8530. We are on campus pretty much every single day of the week. At this point, I think Tuesday is the only time we don't have career office representation. But go ahead and leave us a message if you want. It might just take a little bit longer. You're more likely to get us in a very quick way through the email or contacting us via handshake for an appointment. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gabby.
Hi, everyone. My name's Gabby, and I'm an alum working for the alumni office. And like Jason mentioned, one of the benefits of the alumni office and being involved is lifelong access to the career services. And y'all got a sneak peek at Big Interview, which is great. So you're the first to know about that. Other benefits of staying involved include being able to network and attend events. Right now they're virtual, but if we go back to in-person events, we would love to see you there as well. And you can also stay up to date by updating your mailing address and following us on social media. We'll keep you up to date via newsletters or any posts that we make. And we do have a series of upcoming events that I would love to tell you more about, and they just posted them in the chat. So we have an event tomorrow, but then also our next Topper Career Talk, which is this program, will be on October 22nd, and we'll be going over how to be optimistic and maintaining your well-being and your sanity while you're job searching, which we know is stressful, but we're here to help. So if you have any questions, like Jason said, you can contact his office. You can also reach out to us as SCU alumni at stedwards.edu, and we would love to connect you with the necessary resources. And thank you so much for being here.